of you are well. Sending love to you and your families. I hope you're well. I hope you're healthy. I hope you're safe. And just again, I'm so damn proud of all of you guys. The way you have adopted, the way we continue not just to survive, elevate the thinking, elevate the depth, and really expand consciousness and take all of this to a new level. And by the way, what we are doing and what you're accomplishing and how we are thriving under the most extraordinary moments in our history is exactly what the hell Nietzsche's talking about in chapter 1, about this aristocratic, assertive, joyous, fucking living, no matter how intense, no matter how threatening, no matter how decentering or unstable, this emotional strength and this intellectual creativity to engage in this agon of life, this existential agon, the crisis of meaning, the decentering of fucking human existence, but to say no to the suffering, no to the crippling fear, and to show up and survive, and not just survive, but kick butt. And this is what Nietzsche's talking about in the first essay. So we're living it, you're living it. I'm super proud of you. Okay, a few announcements, and then we're going to finish Nietzsche's first essay. We're going to do the second part of the first essay. So the announcements, as you know, we've been talking about it a little bit already. Midterms due on Thursday. Send it to me by email by midnight Thursday. Take the day. What the hell? Take the day. Just email it to me by end of Thursday. And as Christina asked, it's a great question. Thank you. Please send it as a PDF or a Word form. I won't be able to open it if you send it in any other way. And I'll become quite un-Nietzschean. I'll start to cry and shake, and then I'll just become a quivering mess. So send it in a format I can open easily, and send it by midnight on Thursday, okay? So that's one of the first announcements. Today, we will end this part of the course. We will end Mill and Nietzsche. And on Thursday, we will transition to the last part of the course, an investigation or reading of Rorty's extraordinary book, Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity. We will have a lecture, but the lecture will be kind of brief, and it will serve as a transition from Mill and Nietzsche to Rorty. And I am already quite an old man, and so I don't remember what I've done. Did I send you the transition remarks from Mill, Nietzsche to Rorty? No. Okay.
I don't think you did.
Okay. I can't even remember anymore. So tomorrow, be on the lookout for a document that's going to come in the class email, and it's going to have the transition remarks from Mill/Nietzsche to Rorty. It's going to explain how we're going to frame the movement into Rorty. So I'm going to send that to you. Open it up, print it out if you can, and we're going to use that as the foundation for the discussion on Thursday. And then keep that as you prepare for the final exam as well. All right, so be on the lookout for that. And I'll say more about that on Thursday. Okay. The videos are on YouTube, on Dungey State University. There are 2 of them. Tristan, are we going to get the other ones up there?
We will have last Thursday's one up today, and I'll get this one up today also.
Fabulous. You are heroic, Tristan. Thank you so much. Sending so much love to you. So the videos will be up on YouTube. Apparently, they're getting lots of hits, man. I'm a YouTube star. I'm a blogger. I'm an influencer. So they will be on YouTube if you want to just revisit the videos to help you prepare for the midterm. All right, any questions? Everybody centered? Everybody ready to go? Okay,
I have a
Here we
question,
go.
Professor.
Yep, let's have it.
So for the new book that we're going to be reading, do we have to read any passages of it, or just the document that you're sending?
Nope, don't worry about it. Focus on the information today. Focus on the first essay. Focus on the midterm. We'll deal with Rorty beginning Thursday. I'll make an announcement about what to read in Rorty on Thursday. Okay? All right. Okay, here we go. I'm going to provide a quick finished last Thursday, and we're going to do the second part of the first essay. The thesis of the book. Nietzsche, the whole purpose of the book is twofold. Nietzsche wants to first provide a more accurate and comprehensive analysis. And by the way, this is what he means by genealogy. He wants to provide a more accurate and comprehensive history of the origin, the historical origin, and the meaning of the word good and its original and historical distinction between bad. Then he wants to locate that moment in history, both the moment in history and the conceptual transformation, where the original conception of good and its distinction bad gets transvalued, what we would call changed, or what we would call transformed. Nietzsche's term for it is transvalued, where that original distinction between good and bad, its meaning and distinction, gets transvalued into the distinction good and evil, and in the moment it sort of takes on this new meaning of good and evil. That's the whole purpose of the book, and that's the focus, at least part of the focus. Well, it is a major part of the focus in the first essay. And so if you understand what Nietzsche's doing, if you get that structure and that architecture, you are well on your way to mastering Nietzsche, to understanding the genealogy of morals and understanding the story he tells. All right. Now, last week, we started out a discussion in the first essay about that first part. Nietzsche says, look, what is the real historical origin, and what was the original meaning of this term good? And Nietzsche argues that the original conception of this idea good and its historical origin and what it signified had something to do with this kind of what he'll call this knightly aristocratic, or this kind of aristocratic willingness to create and assert meaning and value and purpose, right? And Nietzsche said, look, the origin of this idea of good didn't belong with the people that we think it did. It belonged with the first people, and this is a kind of abstract theoretical device, but it began with the first people, Nietzsche says, who seized the right to invent meaning, invent value, invent purpose, and not just seized the right in terms of giving their life meaning, giving their life purpose, and giving it value, but to assert it as an exercise of power, what Nietzsche will call the will to power. And so this origin of the idea good, it originates out of people who have the emotional strength and the intellectual creativity to give the world meaning. This is what beauty is. In and of itself, the world has no inherent meaning or purpose. It's real, but it doesn't have meaning. Meaning is something that flows out of human creativity, out of human mind. It's a human invention. And Nietzsche says your origin of the idea of good comes from as a kind of human construction, as a human invention. And it emerges out of this invention of meaning. This is what beauty is. This is what courage is. This is what friendship is. This is what the political institutions look like. This is who rules and why. And Nietzsche sort of romanticizes that in this kind of deep nominalist way. And these people, they literally, as he says, they seize the right to define things. This is this, is this, is this. And it's not just that they cultivate or invent what meaning is, they have the power. This is really critical. They have the emotional power, the physicality, and the kind of creative energy to assert it as an expression of power. This is what Nietzsche means by the will to power. And so when you put these two things together, meaning and value and purpose as a human invention, as an aesthetic, as an artistic sort of phenomenon, and you link that to power as a sort of asserting that this is what things are going to mean, that sort of constitutes the center, what Nietzsche's going to call these knightly aristocratic people. And as he said, and as we talked about last week, he kind of identifies the whole origin of this idea about nominalism, language as a human invention, as an assertion of power, and as something that is ongoing in this agonistic, conflictual way across time and space, which is what he thinks history is. And he says on chapter 26, he says, the lordly right, this aristocratic right of giving names, of literally assigning words, assigning names, assigning meaning and value and purpose, and then asserting that as an act of power. So reality opens up. Reality becomes reality because it's open, it's named, it's stabilized in this extraordinarily powerful artistic expression and this physical vitality and this robust will to power that is kind of giving a world that doesn't possess meaning, that is kind of there but doesn't have beauty, doesn't have value, doesn't have purpose. And these people sort of open up that moment. The lordly right of giving names extends so far, Nietzsche writes, that one may allow oneself to conceive the origin of language itself as an expression of power on the part of the rulers. So language is a human invention. Meaning is a human invention. Value is a human invention. Purpose is an invention. The people that possess the power to create words, to create meaning, to create value, and assert it. That's the origin of the concept of good, and that's the opening of reality. That's the opening of the social and political and conceptual space. And there's something kind of heroic about that for Nietzsche, right? And so that's why Nietzsche says, one should allow oneself to conceive the origin of language itself as an expression of power on the part of the rulers. They say, this is this, is this, is this. And the language is beautiful. It's almost erotic. And in doing so, they seize the world. They take command of it. Reality literally becomes something that has something to do with them. Yeah, Ruth. Can't hear you. Can't hear you.
I think your mic is muted.
Okay. All right, let me go on then. Sorry, Ruth. It shows that your mic isn't muted, but I didn't hear you. I'm so sorry. All right, so again, I don't want to spend too much time there because we talked about that last week. Now, there were two more things that were important about that, all right? And this gets to page 29. And I was suggesting this just a little bit, but I want to remind you of it. It's not just for Nietzsche that these knightly aristocratic people who are the sort of originators of the concept of good. It's not just a kind of intellectual thing. It's incredibly important that part of it is there, but there's also a kind of physicality that goes along with it. There's a kind of character trait. There's a set of character traits that include a kind of robust, kind of warrior-like, vigorous physicality that's associated with this. And I want to remind you about this because this becomes a key moment when the transvaluation of the good bad to the good as moral and the evil as evil happens. And on the top of page, or in the middle of page 29, Nietzsche describes those character types, that kind of robust physicality. He writes, but they also they also invent and assert meaning by a kind of caricature trait, he says. And this is the case that concerns us here. Right? And Nietzsche goes on, these original aristocrats, these knightly aristocratic characters, they conceive of themselves as true. And not true in a metaphysical sense, but true in the sense that what is meaningful and what is real somehow is an expression of them. That reality is true because they've created it, because they have asserted it. They call themselves, he says, for instance, the truthful. That is, in Greek nobility, they call themselves ethlos, the Greek verb ethlos. And in its original sort of etymology, Nietzsche says ethlos meant being. Ethlos meant one who is. And this is before being and one who is takes on a metaphysical, objective character. One has ethlos, one is, one has being, because one is giving meaning to one's life. Purpose is something to do that emanates from that meaning. It emanates from that value. And Nietzsche on 29 says, look, they consider themselves ethlos, signifies one who is, who possesses reality, who is actual. And again, this is not just Nietzsche being poetic, this is Nietzsche being literal. For Nietzsche, in this knightly aristocratic kind of way, before the emergence of this notion of metaphysics and its objective account of a truth and one's reason, before that, the isness of the world, the reality of the world was something that was constructed. And the people who constructed it had this sort of elevated sense of being. They had this elevated sense of isness. I realize that's such a vulgar way of putting it. Isness, but of being, of doing, of acting. Reality had something to do with the manifestation of their creative power and their emotional strength, their emotional fierceness. And so literally they had an elevated sense of being. They had a powerful sense of being. They had a powerful sense of what it meant to exist. They invented what it meant to be, what is means, and they embodied it not just as concepts, but they embodied it as a way of life, as a kind of actual physicality, a moving through the world in active ways. And again, this will become very important. So ethlos signifies one who is, who possesses reality, right? It's beautiful and possesses it because one created it. For Nietzsche, if you possess reality, if you find the emotional strength and the intellectual creativity to give your life meaning and value and purpose, and you have the ability to assert it and engage the agon and bear the responsibility of that, Nietzsche says you are real. You possess a heightened sense of reality. You are actual. Right? And for Nietzsche, this is critical to this whole notion of this knightly aristocratic sense of vitality. Now, I want to move to finish this up by also, this is where we left off on Thursday. This is critical. On the bottom of page 31, it's not just that meaning and value is invented. It's not just that what meaning and value is invented is asserted as a type of power, but the process of doing that, this is critical, the process of doing that in one's own life and the process of doing that out there in the world is inescapably agonistic. It is inescapably a form of combat. I cannot exaggerate the importance of this for Nietzsche and even for us. On all levels of existence, life is a type of agon. Literally, the Greek, the agon it's the Greek word. It means conflict. It's the origin from which we get the word agonistic, to have conflict with something. And for Nietzsche, life is literally, inescapably agonistic. Life physically, existentially, life is difficult. We live in a world that has no inherent meaning or purpose. There are all sorts of things and processes that are the effects of causes that have nothing to do with human mind and are beyond our control. And many of that is threatening and hostile to life. So life, just the ability to maintain life, existence, life itself, and we see this now in this terror of COVID-19, it's agonistic, it's a conflict. To invent meaning and value and to assert it is agonistic. And ultimately, there's this notion of this profound agon between people, between groups of people, as people and groups of people struggle and fight and have this kind of conflict over what the hell things mean and what types of, in the ways in which they have value and ultimately purpose. This is critical. Life is a kind of agon over meaning, right? Even in your own lives now, in various ways, you are engaged in an agon with other members of the community, other people, even people well, by the way, that's called marriage, right? Even with people that you are familiar with. Life is an ongoing agon over meaning. Does meaning derive from you? Does value derive for you? Or is it something that has been imposed upon you? Has your meaning, has your gender norms, has your political power, has your race, has your ethnicity, are all those meanings that have either for better or for worse been imposed upon you and structured and created a world, right? And does that world allow you to flourish and thrive, or does that world cripple you and marginalize you and create resentment inside of you? Right? So for Nietzsche, this idea of agon is critical. It's essential. It's inescapable. And so he says, right, in the middle of page 31, therefore, and he's talking about bonus as a kind of a synonym for the word good. And he says, therefore, bonus, good, the good man. Bonus as the man of strife, of a kind of dissension, of a kind of war. One sees what constituted the good person, and there's a kind of willingness to see agon and to not be afraid of it, not to have it cripple you, but to actually ultimately embrace it, right? To embrace agon, this sort of challenge to live well, to thrive, to give meaning, to give value, to assert it and keep it going. And so this whole issue of agon is critical, and not just critical, but agon in an active way, right? Life is a conflict over it's existential conflict. How long can I live and maintain life before I die? How do I invent and assert my meaning and my value so I'm not oppressed by other people's meanings and values, right? And spiritually, intellectually, emotionally, how long can I keep that going? What does that entail? And for Nietzsche, it entails this kind of extraordinary physicality, a robust physicality, a willingness to act and keep moving forward, keep creating all the time. And again, you have to do that forever. That ceases only in death for Nietzsche. And then finally, the last thing I want to say about this, and then we turn to the second part of the second essay, is Nietzsche says on 33, he kind of wraps all of this up. And he is obsessed with our understanding that this sort of vision of life, this knightly aristocratic vision of life that he's articulating, he's absolutely obsessed that we don't see that in a pessimistic way, that we don't see that in a depressing way or an exhausting way or a terrifying way. This, for Nietzsche, is a kind of joyous affirmation of life, right? And in the middle of 33, Nietzsche writes, the knightly aristocratic value this story, these people, presupposes a powerful physicality. So there's a physical, emotional dimension to this, a robust dimension of this. And he says it presupposes a powerful physicality, a flourishing abundance, and overflowing health together, which helps preserve it, being open to the agon, not being afraid of contestation, right? Finding the courage to challenge that which through meaning tries to oppress you and marginalize you and reduce you to its possession and its mastery. In order to resist that, you have to become powerful. And he says, and all of this, Nietzsche says, it involves a vigorous, a free, a joyful activity, right? And this is key, because we're about to make a turn. We're going to make a transition into how this original notion of what good is, what the people who created and asserted it looked like and how they lived, and how that original historical and conceptual meaning gets transvalued into the meaning we are now familiar with. And before, you know, so before we get there, it's really important to remember that Nietzsche and everything about Nietzsche, as far as he wants to understand himself, is about affirming life, about finding a creative joy, a creative affirmation, a kind of abundance of life, an overflowing abundance of life. And there's a direct connection. Here's one of the keys, you guys. There's a direct connection between being creative, one, in your ability to give your life meaning, being emotionally fierce enough to assert it as a will to power, and here we go, being courageous enough to act on it. Powerful, creative people are people who know that they must give their life meaning. They know they must give their life value. They're able to do it, and they're able to act on it, and act on it in a direct, outward, positive way. So for Nietzsche, there's a direct connection between a kind of healthy spirit, a healthy mind, an abundant mind, and people who are always moving forward, people who are acting. There's something critical about this ability to act. And we're going to see what happens when you can't act in that way anymore. Okay? All right. So what we want to do now is we want to transition to the second part of the first essay. Nietzsche wants to tell the story. So what happened? How is it that this original vision of life, this knightly aristocratic vision of life, expressed by people who had ethos, by people who knew that in and of itself the world had no inherent meaning or purpose, that they had an existential responsibility to give their life and to give that world meaning and value, to make it beautiful, to turn a kind of nothingness and a terror of nothingness into beauty, and to have the physical strength and the emotional courage to assert it, and then to keep it. And to keep it despite all the challenges, all the hardships, all the conflicts, all the suffering, and to do all of that, and at the end of the day, joyously affirm life. Right? And Nietzsche's gonna tell the story, and he's gonna say, what happened to those people? What happened to that perspective? How did that original vision of good and life, how did that original conception and that way of life get transvalued into the distinction we are now familiar with between good, now understood in a metaphysically moral way, and evil? How did that transvaluation happen? And more importantly, or equally important, not just how did it happen, but what has been the consequences to our minds, our bodies, and our politics that have resulted from that transition? How did the transition take place? And by the way, Nietzsche's going to argue it took place with the beginning of metaphysics, the emergence of the idea that there's an objective truth understood as a philosophical idea, a theological God, right? It happened, the change happened when metaphysics emerges in Western history with Socrates and then New Testament Christianity. That's the beginning of the Transvaluation. And then Nietzsche's going to go on in the end of chapter the first essay and say, so one, that's how it happened. And then two, the second of the very important postmodern questions, always important postmodern questions. It's not just about our investigation of whether the truth exists or not, or a suspicion about whether the truth exists or not, but this equally powerful and penetrating question: what are the consequences to our minds, our bodies, and politics that are the result of our belief in a metaphysical / moral truth and our commitment to those ideas? And it's that moment that Nietzsche sees the emergence of this new concept of good and evil, and the emergence of what he will call the slave morality. So this is a critical moment. All right. So let's unpack the story for Nietzsche. And in the book, Nietzsche calls this, or in the outline that I sent and in my lecture notes that I sent to you, Nietzsche calls this moment the challenge from the moral philosophers and the priestly class, right? He kind of conceives of this as a kind of challenge by moral philosophers and the priests. And he's talking specifically about Socrates. He's talking specifically about Plato. He's talking specifically about the emergence of the priestly class of monotheistic religion. So he's talking about a specific people, more or less, and he's talking about a specific transformation in conceptuality. And Nietzsche says the transition, the transvaluation between this original notion of good in this knightly aristocratic manifestation, the transvaluation of that into this notion of good as the good person who is the moral person, Socrates, Jesus, the person who is unegoistic and serves others. This transvaluation emerges out of a challenge by the moral philosophers, by Socrates, by Plato, by the priestly class of the emergent New Testament Christian tradition. There's a challenge by the moral philosophers and by the priests. And again, this, in a kind of genealogical historical way, that's accurate, right? When we have had Political Science 350 together, or some of you were in 411, when we've taught the emergence of Greek political philosophy in Western culture, we've often framed it in that way. We've framed the emergence. I framed the emergence. We framed the emergence of Socrates. We framed the emergence of Plato as intellectuals, as philosophers who emerge on the scene. Socrates in ancient Athens, Plato during the end of the Peloponnesian War and the collapse of the Athenian Empire, the emergence of New Testament Christianity in the waning days of the Roman Empire and its ascendancy to a global religion. We often frame those events as sort of moments in world history where the moral philosophers, the priestly class, what do? They show up. Socrates shows up in Athens. Athens is in crisis. And what does Socrates do? Socrates challenges the Homeric and the tragic worldview, what Nietzsche is calling this knightly aristocratic worldview. Socrates challenges the knightly aristocratic worldview. Plato challenges the knightly aristocratic worldview in the name of metaphysical philosophy, in the name of moral philosophy. And Socrates emerges in Athens. Plato emerges in Athens. Jesus will later, the disciples will later appear in what will soon be the rubbles of the Roman Empire. And these figures, these metaphysical figures, one philosophical, one religious, they emerge and they fundamentally challenge the meaning and the value and the purpose of the world that had been opened by these knightly aristocratic people. Right? The emergence of metaphysical philosophy, of Socrates and Plato as a challenge precisely to the Greeks of the tragic age, precisely to the Greeks of the Homeric epics. The emergence of New Testament Christianity and the apostles and the priests, the emergence of that as a challenge to what is already the end of the Roman Empire, of a challenge on the meaning and the value and the purpose of life. So you see historically the emergence of this challenge. And from Nietzsche's point of view, it's important to see it this way. Nietzsche will interpret the emergence of Socrates and Plato as a kind of challenge by people like Socrates, people like Plato, who themselves wish to give their life and give the political world and give the natural world their own meaning. Nietzsche will see a Socrates, Nietzsche will see a Plato, Nietzsche will see the priestly class of the emerging New Testament Christians as people who desperately want, desperately desire to give their life their meaning, to give their life their value, to give it their purpose. This is critical. And so Nietzsche, deep in Nietzsche's conceptuality is this idea. All people, Nietzsche is going to argue, seek to create and define and express their meaning, their value, and their purpose. Life is agonistic. Socrates isn't immune from this desire. Plato isn't immune from this desire. The priestly class of the emergent New Testament Christianity, they're not immune from this desire. And not only are they not immune from it, not only did Socrates, and if you think about it, right, this is, and from a point of view, Nietzsche would have this really extraordinary love-hate relationship with Socrates, right? If you think what Socrates did from a Nietzschean point of view, on the one hand, Nietzsche's just got to celebrate it, right? Think about what Socrates did with the emergence of metaphysical philosophy. Think what Plato did. Think about what the priestly class of the New Testament Christians did. What they did was fundamentally redefine, reinvent, redefine the meaning of life, the value of life, the purpose of life. They were able to impose their vision, right? And from a certain point of view, Nietzsche would just have to celebrate that. That's bold. Right? Socrates altered world history. Socrates fundamentally set in motion the beginning of a transformation in meaning and value and purpose of human beings in world history, in Western history. Christianity set in motion another version of that. That's extraordinary. So this idea that some challenge would emerge from this philosophical class or this priestly class, Nietzsche understands that. That's not what's interesting. That's normal. Now, here's where the story gets interesting. The first challenge, Nietzsche will argue, to the knightly aristocratic class, to the knightly aristocratic assertion of meaning, value, and purpose, came from the moral philosophers, and it came from the priestly class. And here's the story. Nietzsche's going to argue that the moral philosophers, Socrates and Plato, the emergent priestly class of New Testament Christianity, Nietzsche's going to argue that these groups resented living in the world of meaning and value and purpose created by these knightly aristocratic Greeks. And this is key, right? And so, again, going back, meaning, and the meaning of good, the meaning of beauty, the meaning of masculine, who has power and why. All of that was originally kind of this emergent human invention, an assertion of power in coming, deriving from the Homeric traditions, stylized in Greek tragedy. And these aristocrats of the Greek and the tragic age, these were powerful, robust people. These are the people who created Antigone. These were the aristocrats. And these were the purple people that opened reality. They gave it meaning, they gave it value. And everybody else was just kind of stuck there. You were living in Sophocles' world. You were living in Aeschylus' world. You were living in Pericles' world before the plague killed him. Plague killed Pericles. It wasn't another human being, it was fucking plague. But before the emergence of Socrates, before the emergence of the democracy, before the emergence of moral philosophy, you were living in Pericles' world. You were living in Sophocles' world. You were living in Paris' world. You were living in a world created and opened by other people, for them. And so these philosophers resented living in that world. Socrates resented living in that world. Plato resented living in that world. The New Testament Christians, the priestly class of the New Testament Christians, resented living in the world defined by and made meaningful by and set into purpose by these Romans or by these tragic Greeks. They resented it. They wanted to give their world meaning, their life meaning, value, and purpose. So Nietzsche says that the first challenge came from the priestly class, from the philosophers in the priestly class. But here's the key. Here's the key. While they resented the world created for them, the world in which they lived, and while they desired to transvalue it, to redefine it, redefine the value, redirect the purposes, while they desired to do it, they lacked the ability to do it directly. This is key. They lacked the, and I mean, when I say do it directly, I mean quite literally, physically. The moral philosophers and the priests, they lacked the physical ability. And Nietzsche would even say in a kind of domineering way, maybe they even lacked the emotional strength, the physical strength, the courage to challenge directly and openly the knightly aristocratic order. Now, it's not just that perhaps they were emotionally not prepared to do it or physically, but in a kind of an empirical and material way, they were also weak. They literally didn't have the physical power to do it. Socrates was in no position physically, in terms of strength, in terms of a kind of robust physicality, to physically kind of pick up the sword and challenge a Pericles, and challenge a kind of Greek aristocrat. Wasn't able. And this is even more so for the priests. If you think about the physicality of the early priests, they were ascetics. They were ascetics. They disavowed physical strength. They disavowed a kind of material and martial way of life. They were ascetics. Ascetics means to be kind of, well, it maybe doesn't mean this, but it results in a kind of physical weakness. So Nietzsche is going to argue that the original challenge to the knightly aristocratic came from people who wanted to express their meaning and express their will to power, but were unable to do it directly in a kind of active, direct, open way. The moral philosophers and the priests, Nietzsche argues, were unable to challenge the aristocrats in a direct and physical way. They were emotionally and physically unable to resist this knightly aristocratic class in this kind of open, direct agon. And they knew it. And their inability to do this, this is the key to everything, represented a kind of weakness, a kind of impotence. And they were aware, Nietzsche is going to argue, they were aware of their weakness. They were aware of their impotence. Socrates knew he had to find another way of overturning the knightly aristocratic world order. The early Christians knew they had to find an alternative way of overturning the Roman Empire. These early Christian priests and these early Christian apostles, they have no wealth. They're physically weak. They're ascetics. They're emaciated. How are they going to challenge the Roman Empire directly? It's not possible. And they know it's not possible. They know it. They know that they are weak. And the awareness of their weakness and the awareness of their impotence, by the way, this is the origin of resentment, tortures them. And they have to find a new way of challenging the knightly aristocratic or what was left of the Roman Empire. And this is the origin, Nietzsche argues, of metaphysics. The invention of Platonic metaphysics, an objective truth understood as a kind of idea that's out there, or the invention of the monotheistic Christian God, is a product, is a kind of distorted creative product of the inability of the moral philosophers or the early Christian priests to do actively what they desired to do. Metaphysics, whether it's Plato's idea of justice, God as the Christian conception is monotheistic, that is an invention. It's a create of all things, as Nietzsche says, all things are human inventions, but it's an invention that they believe is true, that they have to believe is true, that they have to posit as real. They invent a metaphysics that gives the cosmos meaning. They invent a God that gives the cosmos meaning. They invent a metaphysics that gives life meaning. They invent a God that gives life meaning. But this metaphysics and this emergent New Testament Christian theology, here we go, they make a virtue out of weakness. Metaphysics, whether Platonic moral philosophy in its own way or New Testament Christianity in its own way, make a virtue out of weakness. Turn weakness and impotence into morality. The moral philosophers are weak. The priests are weak. They can't challenge directly. So they turn their weakness into a kind of virtue. They turn weakness and impotence into virtue. Right? And go back again to the famous discussion between Thrasymachus and Socrates. over justice, over the art of ruling. And it's in the lecture notes I sent you to revisit it. Thrasymachus had said, justice is the advantage of the stronger, the knightly aristocratic class. Justice is the advantage of the stronger, ethlos. And it's the advantage of the stronger because they are the people who seize the right to say this is this is this, and assert it and seal it up. Take possession of the world. Justice is the advantage of the stronger, by which Thrasymachus meant those who make the laws. And it's a metaphor for those who define and determine meaning and value and purpose. And in the great debate between Thrasymachus and Socrates in the first book of Plato's Republic, this is the moment of Western history. Thrasymachus is what is left of this knightly, aristocratic, tragic perspective. Justice is the advantage of the stronger. The people who define and create and assert meaning, they possess ethlos. The world is theirs because they've defined it. And Thrasymachus makes his stand. And Socrates says, no. And again, even in Plato's Republic, the imagery is so profound. When we talk about physical robustness and vitality and the weak and the aging, Socrates, even in the Republic, if you remember book 1 or go back and read it, when the great debate between Thrasymachus and Socrates is about to occur, right? Plato describes Thrasymachus as hunched up, looking like a wild animal, this profound, robust physicality that's about, and Plato says that Thrasymachus is going to leap into the conversation and dominate the conversation. And Plato writes several times during the conversation, Thrasymachus' colleagues had to hold him back and hold him back. And so you even got this imagery in Plato, this physically robust aristocrat Thrasymachus, who says, I'll tell you what justice is. Justice has something to do with the people who define, create meaning and value and purpose and assert it. And Thrasymachus said, it's just that the weak follow. And Socrates is quivering, Plato writes. Socrates, the weak, the aging Socrates, is quivering. He thinks Thrasymachus is going to destroy him physically. But Socrates, but the friends restrain Thrasymachus. And Socrates then says to Thrasymachus, you're wrong about that. Justice isn't the advantage of the stronger. Justice and the good person is a person who acquires, in this case, philosophical knowledge, Socrates says, moral knowledge. And this person uses this moral knowledge, this truth, to serve others. And so right there, while Plato is celebrating this and Western culture celebrates this, Nietzsche is saying there's the end. There's the transvaluation. The weak Socrates transvalues, redefines what the good person is. The weak, the unegoistic, the weak Socrates turns weakness, unegoistic actions into morality. And the good person is the unegoistic, serving others. So for Nietzsche, and we're going to talk about this now, we're going to go to the book and talk about it, but let's talk about it conceptually. So for Nietzsche, metaphysical morality, Christian morality, emerges out of a kind of resentment. It emerges out of an awareness of one's weakness and the need to turn one's weakness, one's impotence, into morality, into virtue. So Platonic morality, Christian morality emerges out of hatred. It's a creative act born out of hatred. It's a creative act born out of precisely what it can't resist, what it hates. Platonic morality, Christian morality, is born out of hatred for what it can't resist. It is forced to turn weakness and impotence into virtue, into morality. So it is originally, in the most profound sense, born of hatred. It is born out of hatred for this world. It is born out of hatred for its own weakness, for its own impotence. It's born out of what Nietzsche will call a great no to life, no to joyous affirmative assertion of meaning. And because it's born out of the great no, out of the hatred, it becomes itself monstrous. Metaphysics is monstrous, Nietzsche's going to argue. The slave morality is monstrous. The effects on our minds and our bodies and our politics that result from our belief that Platonic morality or Christian theology is real and that we're committed, the effects on our minds, bodies, and politics from that belief are monstrous. They have created the slave morality, and they've deformed our minds. They've deformed our souls. And so Nietzsche says on page 32, right in the middle of the page, there is from the first, he writes. And again, when he says the first, he literally means the origin, the origin of the transvaluation, the process by which weaknesses and impotence are made into virtues. That's what he's talking about. There is something from the first. That's what that means. There is the first unhealthy, something unhealthy in the priestly, in the philosophical and priestly aristocracies, and in the habits ruling them, which turn them away from action and alternate between brooding and emotional explosions, right? Plato can't physically resist or challenge Thrasymachus. The early Christians in the Roman Empire can't physically resist or challenge the Romans. So they have to turn inward. And they have to make a virtue and a morality out of their weakness. And this is what he's talking about. There is from the first something unhealthy. And by the way, this is the origin of resentment. The unhealthiness is that we have resentment in our minds. We know and even now we know we're living in somebody's world. We're living in a world defined by these stupid concepts of beauty, or these LSATs, or these notions of wealth. And this world is created by us, by the Kardashians and by the George Clooney's and by these people. And it's imposed. And it marginalizes and makes slavish. But we can't resist it, so we live in these worlds. We can't, and we know we hate it, but we don't know what else to do, so we become unhealthy. There is something from the first unhealthy in the priestly aristocracies and in the habits ruling them, which turn them away from action and alternate between brooding and emotional. So we turn inward, we get inside our heads. We get inside our heads. Oh, those bastards. One day I'll get my revenge. One day I'll have my moment. We get in our head, and our weakness and our resentment starts turning, and it starts turning. And while it's turning, think what are we doing? We're inventing some way to get revenge. We're inventing some way to make weakness into a virtue and to take our revenge. Bottom of 32. And this process is devastating to us, Nietzsche says. The effects are monstrous. And he says, for with the priests, he says on the bottom of 32, for with the priests, everything becomes more dangerous. Not only the cures and remedies, but also arrogance, revenge, profligacy, lust to rule, disease. Right? So moral truth and New Testament Christianity are born out of the need to make the awareness, to make weakness and impotence a virtue. But the people caught in that moment can never, ever forget. They can never escape that this is what happens. That their morality is born out of hatred. That their morality is born out of impotence.
Professor, I have a question.
Quickly.
So wouldn't Nietzsche agree with a lot of things that Mill says, besides all of the metaphysical parts of his arguments? Because Mill is kind of saying, all right.
Yeah, so let me just say, although quickly, Nietzsche is going to celebrate, if he celebrates anything at all in Mill, it's going to be this sort of interest in self-creation. But we have to remember, and by the way, I wrote this in those transition notes that I typed up and sent to you between Mill and Nietzsche, right? Nietzsche is going to argue that Mill's notion of freedom, the very tools that Mill tells you to sort of operationalize, and the way to think about yourself and the way to think about freedom. From Nietzsche's point of view, that advice, is that advice going to liberate you, or is it going to make you, turn you into the slave morality? Slave morality. Okay? Now, middle of 33. Now, things get kind of heavy. So we have to be strong now. Nietzsche, middle of 33. It is because of their impotence. The philosophers and the priests had to turn weakness into morality. The good person is now the weak, the unegoistic person that serves others. But it never leaves their mind that they were forced to turn their own weakness into morality. And this resentment grows and grows inside of them. Middle of 33, it is because of their impotence. It is because of their weakness. Their great deed, their great morality derives from hatred. It derives from weakness. It is because of their impotence that in them hatred grows to monstrous and uncanny proportions. Okay, frame, again, the question, what are the consequences to our minds, bodies, and politics that result from our belief in a metaphysical and moral truth and our commitment to those actions? In us, Nietzsche is arguing, grows a hatred, a self-hatred, a hatred for the world, a resentment, a pessimism, a nihilism. It is because of their impotence that in them hatred grows to monstrous and uncanny proportions. If you are experience this in your own life right now, if you're in a relationship that you don't want to be in, if you are the object of valuations that you don't want to be the object of, but you can't resist it, you're afraid to resist it, you don't know how to resist it, you can't see your way out, you're afraid to make your way out. What grows inside of you? What's the consequence to your soul of knowing that that's where you are?
Resentment.
Resentment. It is because of their impotence that in them hatred grows to monstrous and uncanny proportions, to the most spiritual and poisonous kinds of hatred. The truly great haters in the world, in world history, have always been the priests. Likewise, the most ingenious haters. So Nietzsche is arguing The very people who had to turn weakness and impotence into virtue, who had to do so out of hatred, because of their awareness of it, their awareness to escape that awareness, become monstrous. The priests become monstrous. The moral philosophers become monstrous in their severity, in their judgment, in their demand that you live this way, that you preach this way, you pray this way, you marry this way. And then Nietzsche, on the top in 34, describes the transvaluation, one of the most important moments of the first essay. Are you ready? So what comes of all of this hatred? What comes of all of this impotence? And Nietzsche writes, for this alone was appropriate to a priestly people, the people embodying the most deeply repressed priestly vengefulness, the moral philosophers, the New Testament Christians. It was the metaphysicians who, with awe-inspiring consistency, dared to invert the aristocratic value equation. Good equals noble, equals powerful, equals beautiful, equals happy. And to invert that aristocratic value and to now say, now this is the new good, this is the new morality. The wretched alone are the good. The poor, the impotent, the lowly alone are the good. The suffering, the deprived, the sick, the ugly alone are pious. Alone are they blessed by God. Blessedness is for them alone. And for you, this is Plato saying to Thrasymachus, this is you, Jesus saying to the Roman Empire, and you, the powerful and the noble, are on the evil, the cruel, the lustful, the insatiable, and the godless to all eternity. And you shall be in all eternity damned. So that's the transvaluation. Now the weak and the wretched and the depraved, they are the good. They are blessed by God. They are saved. Weakness and impotence becomes a virtue. And now we fear Thrasymachus. We fear Pericles. We fear the robust, the creatively, the intellectually creative, and the physically robust people of the world. We fear them. We ostracize. We deny. We repress. And this, Nietzsche says, is the beginning of the slave morality, and the slave morality born out of resentment. Page 36. The slave revolt, Nietzsche writes, section 10, page 36. The slave revolt in morality begins when hatred, when resentment itself becomes creative and gives rise to values. The slave morality is the morality born out of hatred. It's a morality born out of impotence. It's the turning of weakness into virtue. That is the slave morality. Metaphysics is born out of hatred over what it can't resist. It's born out of resentment of living in a world defined by these knightly aristocratic people. The slave revolt in morality begins when resentment itself becomes creative and gives birth to values. Here's the new value. The weak are the good. Impotence is valuable. The resentment of the natures, here it is, the resentment of the natures that are denied the true reaction, that of deeds, and compensate themselves with an imaginary revenge. while every noble morality, knightly, aristocratic, tragic, while every noble morality develops from a triumphant assertion or affirmation of itself, the slave morality, as we said earlier, from the outset says no to what is outside, to know what it can't master, what it can't resist, what it can't overcome. And this no, born out of what it can't master, this hatred of what it can't master, this no becomes its great creative deed. This inversion of valuation, the need to direct one's view outward to God instead of back to oneself, is the essence of resentment. Now, we're out of time. I just want to give you the political version of this. And this gets to Avo's question as well. And there's a version of this kind of floating around on the midterm. So Nietzsche is clearly concerned with the emergence of metaphysical morality. He thinks it produces the slave morality, which is nothing but resentment and hatred. Now, Nietzsche sees the political version. What's the political version of this? For Nietzsche, the political version of the slave morality is modern liberal egalitarian democracy. For Nietzsche, the political equivalent of the slave morality is the emergence of modern egalitarian democracy, where everything is equal, where everybody is celebrated, everybody gets a participation trophy, nobody can be triggered, everything must be safe. And so Nietzsche is incredibly critical of not only the emergence of metaphysical morality, but its political equivalence. All right. I'm over time. Does anybody want to ask a question while we're here? I've got 2 minutes.
I have a question.
Yep. Go.
So you're saying how the philosophers challenged the pre-Socratic era for their systems of thought by introducing metaphysical systems of thought. Nietzsche is saying that we today need to challenge the metaphysical systems of thought to create our own meaning, and thus creation is the ultimate freedom and whatnot.
And yes, so yes. Now the question is, can we do it? Do you and I have the emotional strength and the sort of intellectual creativity to do it? Or do we live in worlds that we know have been created for us, that we somehow don't have the courage to resist or the intellectual power to redefine? And it weighs on us, and it weighs on us. And knowing that we can't resist it, knowing that God is dead, but we still live as if God is real. The resentment that creates in us, the sickness that it creates in us. Do you have the power, the emotional strength, the intellectual creativity to give your life meaning and value and purpose, and to assert it in active, outward ways, healthy ways? Or are you carrying the meaning of who you are? Sinful, dirty, you failed the LSAT. You're not beautiful enough. You're unhealthy. Are you carrying that around as some meaning of some ideal, some physical ideal, some beauty ideal, some intellectual ideal? Did you not do well on the LSAT and you believe what it says about you? And has that shattered you? Who are you? Whose world do you live in? That's Nietzsche.
Hey, Professor, I have a question.
Yeah, quickly.
So if Nietzsche says that the political equivalent of the slave morality is modern liberal egalitarian democracy, what is the alternative that he provides?
This is a great question. He doesn't have a good answer. And his answer, and by the way, this is going to set up very nicely what Rory tries to do. But Nietzsche's answer is that you have to, as much as humanly possible, sort of disentangle yourself from that world. You have to, as much as humanly possible, disentangle yourself from that world. And now I'm going to read you a passage. I read you at the preface, and now this is going to hopefully make more mistakes. First, so the goal. What's the goal? What's the goal of Nietzsche's notion of freedom? What's the goal? One, to get rid of resentment, right? To become free of resentment. That's the first thing. And two, to begin the process of disentangling yourself from the herd, from the normality, from the mediocrity. And then two, and then three, this beautiful passage towards the end of the preface. On page 17 of the preface, the goal, as Nietzsche writes, until at length, Nietzsche writes, already in the preface, he's writing what the goal is. Until at length, page 17 of the preface, until at length, he writes, this long, heroic, creative, emotionally fierce journey, until at length, he writes, I had a country of my own, a soil of my own, an entire, discrete, thriving, flourishing world, like a secret garden, the existence of which no one suspected. To free yourself of resentment, to become creative in the imagining and the asserting of your own meaning, and to cultivate the secret garden of your life.
Got it. Thank you.
Yes, I've got another class, Ruth, really quickly.